Hey everyone, welcome back to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. Today I'm going to be making a little video on the Incarnation. It seems like a pretty good time of the year to do that as Christmas is coming up in just a few days. A lot of the time we think about the Incarnation, I think just normally we think about the Incarnation as a point in time when God decided sort of externally to take on flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, who was a Jew from Nazareth, and that prior to that, you have the sort of pre-existent Son who is without flesh, and he was sort of, in some ways, distinct from the person Jesus, the man Jesus, the flesh and blood Jesus of Nazareth, right? I want to complicate that a little bit today and just kind of give you some food for thought on a different way of sort of thinking about these matters that was really introduced to me by reading Robert Jenson's systematic theology, and I found it really refreshing. This sort of different view of the pre-existent Word, the Incarnation, and also the resurrected Christ, and how all of these things are sort of connecting together. So in Jenson's systematic theology, the first volume, in John's prologue, we read that in the beginning was the Word, and that the Word then became flesh. However, in the same gospel, we find this Word himself testifying to the mode of pre-existence. Quote, before Abraham was, I am. It is precisely this aggressively incarnate protagonist of this gospel's narrative who says this of himself. And he puts his antecedents to Abraham in the present tense. That's from page 139. So Jenson argues here that the Word is always aggressively incarnate. And as Sang-Hoon Lee, who wrote a wonderful book on Robert Jenson, writes, kind of a play on the debates about the pre-existent Word. There was no time, for Robert Jenson, when the Word was not the man Jesus. There was no time when the Word was not the man Jesus. And some examples that Jenson kind of gives for this is that we see Jesus sort of appearing to several people, even in the Jewish scriptures, in the Tanakh. He engages with Israel, and I know that there are going to be certain sort of historical critical scholars who have a problem with these sorts of theological moves, but I think they're right. I think they're important also for keeping a continuity between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New. So we kind of have to say that Jesus is showing up back in those pages of Scripture. He engages with Israel in a sort of fleshly manner. He can indulge in a little wrestling match with Jacob, as Jenson writes, or sit down to Abraham and Sarah's cooking, or converse with humans as his own angel, and establish an earthly address at number 1 Temple Avenue. And this is from Jenson's Toward a Christian Doctrine of Israel. So there's the quote that I forgot to pull up when I was reading it. In these sorts of encounters that we see attested to by the Tanakh, Israel received the Word and uttered the words of prophecies in the Spirit. So as Lee writes, the Word that came to the prophets was the retroactive existence of the risen one. The retroactive existence of the risen one. From the heaven of the future, by the Spirit. From the heaven/future, by the Spirit. So in Israel's past, we have Jesus actually arriving from the eschatological future as Jesus and directly encountering and speaking with and sitting with the people of Israel. And then we have the same Word appearing in the New Testament after Jesus' death and resurrection. After the resurrection, so this is Lee's work, the presence of Jesus is not restricted by space and time as we are in this age. Right? As Jenson puts it, Jesus did not simply return to inhabit the witnesses' space and time, but he appeared when and as he would, and then vanished from their sight. So as the Gospel of John tells us, although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them. So Jenson writes, if we ask where Jesus was, so to speak, resident during the days of his appearances, the immediately available answer to us is that he was in heaven, the heaven of the apocalypses. That is, in God's final future, from which he showed himself, where the Spirit showed him to the chosen. So Jesus, post-resurrection, is located in the eschatological future, making himself known, breaking in from the eschatological and apocalyptic heavens. That's his location. He's not confined to space and time. In fact, the way that he interacts with space and time is really sort of moving through it in ways that we can't, right? Lee summarizes Jenson's view pretty brilliantly here. For Jenson, the event of the resurrection that occurred in the middle of history determines the content of the future, and it recursively breaks into any or some point of time of history as the futural and liberating power. So this occasional kind of breaking into history is an eschatological revelation. It's coming from the eschaton. So accordingly, again, the risen one appears in apocalyptic fashion. Paul calls what he saw a revelation, apocalypsis. Jenson states what certain persons saw after his death was a reality of that future. So Jesus is risen into the future that God has for his creatures. Now he is in the eschaton, and he is the eschatos. He is coming to us by the rushing power of the Spirit, which is the Spirit of the future, this liberating power. He comes by the Spirit as he comes from the future. Okay? This is a very different way of thinking about Jesus' presence among us, right? Jenson's claim seems to be that the pre-existent Word, the Son, right, the Son prior to Jesus' earthly incarnation, in the beginning of creation, is not the Logos Asarkos, or the Word without flesh. It's not the Logos Asarkos. There's been a massive debate over this in the history of theology. But he's going on the side of there is no Word without flesh. There is really only the Logos and Sarkos. But the fully divine and fully human Jesus of Nazareth, who inhabits God's future, the eschaton. The view requires a revisionary conception of time, of course, which is probably where some of you listening may be struggling. Time is sort of more like a helix. It kind of spirals around the risen Christ. So Jesus can sort of access all different points in time from that eschatological future, which is kind of one and the same as the pre-existence of the Son. There's no difference there, right? I think the really kind of interesting thing about this during Advent and Christmas season, when we celebrate the Incarnation, is just how central for Jenson this God becoming flesh in Jesus is in the very being of God. The Incarnation wasn't some sort of external decision that God made some point in time, like, oh, I'll be Jesus now. I'll come down now. I wasn't before even really intending that, but now I'm going to. As Jenson writes, the Incarnation happens in eternity as the foundation of its happening in time. In eternity as the act of decision that is God. And in time as the carrying out of what God decides and who God is, right? So there is a kind of antecedent incarnation in the very being of God, and then you have the working out of that in space and time. So incarnation is so central to the identity of God for Jenson. And Jenson continues quoting Karl Barth, to intend the Son's preexistence, we must look to where the reality of the divine human person of Jesus Christ, before the foundation of all other reality, is identical with the eternal purposes of God. And where the eternal purpose of God that precedes all created reality is identical with the reality of the divine human person, Jesus Christ. So when we ask who is the second identity of the eternal triune life, in which the created life of the Son is decreed, the answer is that same incarnate Son, not some Son behind or beyond Jesus in eternity past. As Jenson writes, the triune God's eternity is precisely the infinity of the life that the Son, who is Jesus the Christ, lives with his Father in their spirit. It is in that infinity that Christ precedes himself. So this Christmas, I hope that you kind of consider this radical and possibly new account of Jesus's incarnation to you, that it wasn't an event that just happened in space and time thousands of years ago, but that the person, Jesus Christ himself, is the second person of the Trinity who pre-exists himself in God's infinity. And that very same Jesus, resurrected into God's future, breaks into our world through the life-giving and future-opening movement of the Spirit from that very eschatological future, here and now. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. And I just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas. So don't forget to like and subscribe. And this has been Apocalypse here, Christianity you can live with.